Thousands of Long Islanders have lost their lives because of the coronavirus pandemic. Among the casualties, many who were desperately waiting for the gift of life in the form of organ transplants. A Newsday investigation discovered many hospitals at the height of the crisis last year shut down their transplant programs, creating a deadly dilemma for some of the most vulnerable patients. One of them, Carissa Gordon.
And I looked in the mirror, I'm like, my eyes don't look the same. Like, it looks weird. My eyes look yellow. Well, I got sick really quick. My hair fell out really, really, really bad. I realized I had like these purple bumps on my hands. It was like on every fingertip.
Carissa Gordon's active life was turned upside down in 2020.
I didn't know that my liver was failing.
On April 1st, Carissa was rushed unconscious to Northwell Health's Long Island Jewish Medical Center. Doctors said if she didn't get a liver transplant soon, she would die. Her crisis couldn't come at a worse time.
Rapid response, F3.
In a little-notice decision, Northwell and other New York hospitals suspended transplant operations for 2 months while trying to deal with the tidal wave of COVID patients.
In April, when the system was overwhelmed, organ donation ceased in New York. Historically, organ donation never had to pause for any period of time that we had with COVID.
For April and May, we postponed all of our scheduled living donor kidney transplants out of an abundance of caution for the healthy donors.
When Carissa Gordon arrived at Northwell, desperate for a liver transplant, there seemed nothing doctors could do.
I just remember coming in, evaluating her, doffing and donning and examining her and saying, she's going to die, she needs to get transplanted straight away. How could we pull this off?
To their knowledge, I only had a couple more hours left to live, and if I didn't get the liver, I was gone.
Carissa Gordon's life was saved in the middle of the night. Northwell contacted Mount Sinai and arranged for Carissa's operation there after finding a liver without COVID infection, donated by a Massachusetts woman killed in a car accident.
The night that I came to live at Mount Sinai, I was put at the top of the transplant list. I was like, next up, for if there's any available liver out there, it'll be coming to me because I only had a few hours left to live.
Carissa was one of the lucky ones.
We had lots of our patients who were waiting who got COVID and died. We had patients who came in for a transplant, got tested, were COVID positive, and couldn't be transplanted, went home and died.
In New York alone, the impact of this shutdown cost many lives.
I think collectively, at least several hundred patients who needed transplants were affected, either by getting COVID themselves and dying or becoming too sick to be transplanted, or by having the natural progress of their disease advance. So it's probably several hundred patients.
After recovering, Carissa learned just how fortunate she was.
I didn't know that they were shutting things down. My heart goes out to those people because imagine hearing that. Like, you really need a transplant and you're hearing due to COVID, and we don't know when COVID's going to end because we're still in COVID. We're shutting down all liver transplants and, all transplants, period. I would become so devastated.
Some patients ended up dying even though they received a transplant. In the case of one Long Islander, the operation sealed her fate by leaving her immune system vulnerable to the COVID-19 virus.
They moved to Long Island for a better life comparatively to the city. I think they wanted more of a slower pace of life.
Jennifer Luong's mother, Wei Fong Luong of Wantagh, immigrated to New York from Hong Kong. She met her husband Paul in Queens, and the couple moved to Long Island in the 1980s. Shortly after retirement, Wei Fong learned she had kidney disease and would need a transplant.
Because she kind of kept that secret, I guess, from my brother and I.
Just before hospitals halted transplant because of the pandemic, Wei Fong Luong was surprisingly offered a kidney at NYU Langone in Manhattan. The kidney came with hepatitis C, a viral infection that would require additional treatment along with anti-rejection medication. She was willing to take the chance.
Despite this crazy wave of virus and COVID happening, she felt like she was so lucky. It was like, oh my God, I don't even have to go through dialysis because I have a match for a new organ.
Wei Fang was elated. A few days after her transplant, she went home, but remained fearful of infection, especially from the emerging coronavirus.
So I would say the week after my mom got back from the hospital after the transplant is probably around the time that my dad contracted the virus. I would say it was a matter of a couple of days or maybe 4 days that between him getting the symptoms and then her feeling sick.
Wei Feng Luong went back to the hospital and died of COVID on May 29th at age 70.
Yeah, it was sad. I mean, I didn't know that was going to be the last time I would see my mom. I mean, I wish I had more time, you know?
Rather than wait for a kidney that might never come, she took her chance in the middle of a pandemic. Doctors say there were many more like her.
We haven't even been able to quantify yet the true impact that COVID has had on the waiting list because we still have patients dying. I just found out yesterday one of my young patients, 40-something-year-old guy, passed away, and this morning I found out that it was from COVID, and he was waiting for an organ for the last 2 years.
Jennifer remembers her mother whenever she looks across the river at the hospital where she died.
I wish my mom was here to be able to, I can take them and kind of do the walks, especially when it was nice out during the summer.
A Lyndenhurst family suffered a similar heartbreak during the pandemic. Ramon Garcia somehow managed to get a kidney transplant, but in the end, he still lost his life.
He had like a understanding that at the end of the day, if he got it, it was over for him. And he already knew that.
He told you that?
Yeah, we'd always talk about it.
Ramon Garcia grew up battling kidney disease. In 2008, he received his first transplant. Then, in 2019, he needed another.
They said that he needed a transplant, but they said it's 8 years the least for him to get a kidney. But they call us that somebody has they got a kidney with hepatitis C, and then the doctor said no problem, we can treat the hepatitis C and take it.
Fanny says her son had little choice but to accept the kidney. The transplant went well. When the pandemic began, Ramon quarantined at home for months. Around Christmas, several family members contracted COVID. Then he tested positive and was taken immediately to the hospital.
When I did call him when he was in the hospital, it's like, did you have it? He said, yeah. And, it's kind of like trying to uplift the moment, you're going to be okay, but, things unfold how they do.
Over the next several days, Ramon's new kidney failed. He ended up dying in the hospital, with his family unable to see him.
I couldn't say goodbye. I couldn't touch my son, give a hug. This wasn't kill me. This is the worst thing that can happen to a person. Yeah, I couldn't say goodbye, or he couldn't say, that he died alone. He wanted to have a normal life, but sometimes he couldn't do it because, the disease. But he wanted to do it. Really, I admire him because of that.
The pandemic was not without its miracles. One case in point, a Hofstra administrator's life was saved by a former student.
Well, I certainly became concerned when my function, my kidney function really started reducing, and I wasn't sure when they'd do transplants again.
Houston Doherty, Hofstra University's vice president for student life, was waiting for a kidney during the transplant shutdown. His plans for surgery at NYU Langone were put on hold. For nearly a decade, Doherty had worked with students at Hofstra, but by 2020, he'd lost nearly 150 pounds because of his failing kidney. His search for a live donor included his wife, Kimberly.
Weirdly, everything matched. Tissue, blood, everything was a match. I was a little too heavy and a little old. You know, once they got someone who was so much healthier, you know, just younger, it was kind of a no-brainer.
That person was 27-year-old Reba Patorti, a former Hofstra student. They had worked together, and she considered Houston a mentor.
Houston needed a kidney. He is an outrageously phenomenal human being, and so he needed help, and so I just helped him.
After confirming she was a good match, Reba decided to break the news in person.
He told me about how someone had been, you know, kind of far along in the process. Something was looking really good. There was someone really promising. They were just kind of waiting, you know, for final steps. And I just kind of looked at him and I said, that person is me.
In essence, she said, well, you don't have to wait any longer. I said, what? She said, yep, I'm a match.
But their plans for a transplant at NYU were postponed when COVID hit. Houston felt himself getting sicker.
Because so many things have to fall into place for a transplant to work, when you get to the point that it seems like it has fallen into place, it's then devastating when something like COVID comes.
What if things go really south and he's not able to get the transplant, or it's not safe for Reba?
When they finally entered the hospital in June, after 4 months of waiting, Houston and Reba were checked for any signs of the virus.
The first and most important test that they were going to do was see if I had the COVID-19 antibodies. And if I did, I couldn't be a donor anymore.
Reba had checked into the hospital at the same time. We were on the same floor, so we were in rooms next to each other. And we were, you know, texting each other and, you know, has your test come up negative? Has my test come up negative? And then thankfully they both did. And there was a phenomenal relief.
Their surgery during the COVID crisis was a success.
I function entirely the same. I have not missed a beat.
Was there ever a point during the COVID crisis that you thought that you might die because of the delays that the disease had caused?
Well, one of the things about needing an organ transplant is that it really does get you in touch with your mortality. I mean, for the last 2 years, I've thought about my life and the length of my life more than I have ever. It was very difficult to deal with that notion that if transplants don't reopen for a long period of time, I would either need to start dialysis or perhaps not even be able to survive that. That was really, really difficult to come to grips with.
One of the smallest survivors of the COVID transplant crisis is a little boy named Nathaniel Capello. His family now calls him Warrior for how hard he fought to survive.
It was scary. I didn't know if he was going to make it.
COVID was just one threat to Nathaniel Capello's health. After being born 3 pounds 12 ounces in September 2019, he soon showed signs of severe liver disease. In January 2020, his belly button burst.
I was changing Nathaniel's pamper, and I noticed that his belly button was leaking. Now, the pamper was just full of green liquid.
It looked like someone was spraying water out of a water gun. It was just shooting out of the belly button. So I grabbed cloths. I was just trying to put pressure on it to kind of stop the liquid from coming out. But at that point, it was just so much.
Nathaniel wound up in Mount Sinai.
You can't get any sicker as a human being. A belly full of fluid, on a ventilator. The liver makes the clotting factors, so if your liver doesn't work, you can't stop bleeding. In fact, this child's heart stopped. And the ICU resuscitated the child and was able to literally bring the kid back to life to consider, was transplant possible?
Alexandra hoped she could save her son.
We had the surgery scheduled in March, and I was supposed to be the donor. They came in and told me that although everything looked good, the way my liver was set up is that neither of us would make it through the surgery.
To make matters worse, because of the overflow of COVID patients at Mount Sinai and treatment tents being set up outside, Nathaniel and his parents were isolated inside their hospital room.
It was literally like we were stuck in that one little room. It was a very, I guess, creepy feeling. It wasn't all I saw were like these white tents. And it was just I didn't see anyone else there, so like at that point I wasn't very scared, but it was just a very eerie feeling.
Nathaniel's odds of getting a transplant became even slimmer when fear of COVID infection halted living donations.
They told us that the only way he would survive and the only way he would be able to get a transplant is if we had a deceased donor.
With their baby dying before their eyes, Dennis and Alexandra got the call they desperately needed. Transplant officials found a possible liver donor in Maine.
They told us that the gentleman who would be donating a piece of his liver was murdered. They also told us that he did drugs like heroin and stuff, but that it wouldn't affect Nathaniel. They said we had nothing to worry about, so we went in and we accepted it.
And we were able to fly our team during all this pandemic with all the challenges associated, and we were able to bring that liver back, which was from an adult, which was way bigger than would fit in the baby, and we cut off the smallest anatomic piece that we can cut off. This is technically at the extreme of what we can do. And throw on top of it to do it in the middle of the epicenter of a pandemic where 800 out of 1,000 of the beds in the hospital are occupied by people with COVID.
The remarkable result? A little boy living his life once again.
He's doing pretty good right now. The doctors are still monitoring him and stuff, but all his labs are good. He's developing so fast.
When the gift of life transplant system was interrupted, organ donation plummeted and was slow to recover. Doctors eventually learned ways to prevent COVID infection during transplants. However, vaccines that have been so effective in preventing the disease for many haven't been as effective for transplant patients. Doctors are still telling those patients to keep their masks on, just to be safe. For Newsday, I'm Thomas Mayer.